Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. I am Zsolt Rejle, a senior research fellow at the Institute, and I'm going to be your host and the moderator of this roundtable panel discussing strategic cooperation between Russia, China, and India. And I would like to introduce to you our participants. I would like to give a very special welcome to Professor Emeritus Gardner from the American University of Paris, to Professor Ramachandra Byrappa, who is a senior research fellow at this institute, and also to Dr. Sándor Seremet, also senior research fellow at this institute. As you saw probably in the invitation, we are going to discuss today and examine the evolving dynamics among three major powers. These powers, India, China, and Russia, are partly redefining our global order, or at least they are trying to do that. While their leaders express shared interest and closer cooperation, their relations are defined by delicate balance of mutual interests and underlying mistrusts. So considering this, I set up a series of questions starting from a very general approach, and maybe later we can focus on something more specific. I would like to ask the participants, what do you think? What are the basic characteristics of the relationships between India, China, and Russia? Maybe Hall, you would like to start.
Give us basic ones.
Thank you.
I'll miss something like yes. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here for my stay in Budapest Hungarian Institute. It's a great honor to experience the city and to be here. Supposedly, when Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin are supposedly going to meet, maybe the next 2 weeks. Anyway, that does have an effect on this conversation because each one of these states, while they're trying to interrelate with each other, also have to interact with the Americans, and that's creating a little bit of problem for all of them. So on the one hand, I will say that there's a push relationship where the Americans are beginning to push all three together in different ways, particularly recently with sanctions on India, which was quite surprising in my view. On the other hand, they have their own tensions among themselves, and that kind of holds them from moving into a totally closer alliance. But certainly, the global system is, in my view, evolving in such a way that you'll have one center pole, United States, and linked to NATO, and Russia, China moving closer together. They still have their tensions, but their tensions are less than that with India. India is in a balancing position between these two powers, and it's really between a rock and a hard place in my view at the moment. It's had its war with China, and it's trying to get over the war 2 years ago. A war that repeated itself since '62 when Mao and India had a little bit of a conflict. And so what I'm saying here is that the three powers are still interacting with the Americans, and to what extent they'll align against the United States in its quest for hegemony, or it's their quest to counter the American hegemony. We'll put it that way. It's still in question, but nevertheless, this is my last point. The tension that's developed as India threatens to swing one way or the other changes the global balance, and I really think that's where the crisis in our relations are. India is really going to be a central power as it emerges, and its impact on both U.S., Europe, and Russia, China might be decisive in the coming years if it builds. No, India's not the only one, but it's world's most populous power. So anyway, I'll leave it there and then see if you have some critical remarks.
Thank you. Professor Byrappa, what is your point on characteristic of the relationship of these three countries? How do you see them?
All three countries are good friends of Donald Trump. All the three leaders are very good friends. So that's one of the biggest characteristics, so I have to say. And all of them find the United States very useful. That's the second characteristic. And all three countries are now Asian countries. Before there was a doubt whether Russia is Europe or Asia. Now Russia is definitely an Asian power, so it makes sense. So that changes the relations. They now have a common interest, and if they come together, they can build a core Asian order that can then be greater, I feel. Yeah.
Do you think they can be considered also together global powers, or mostly their influence will be reduced to Asia?
They for the moment, what I see is that they just want to build an Asian order to consolidate Asia so that Europe and the West doesn't come and meddle in the Asian affairs.
Thank you very much. And I would like to give the word to Dr. Sándor Seremet.
Thank you very much. Well, I would most probably agree to my colleagues with a slight fine-tuning on the Russian-Asian approach, as they're stressing that they're not Asian, they're Eurasian. So they're like they're pushing this Eurasian narrative, which they believe is transcending the Asian element or the European element in general. Regarding the relation, I think all the three together, they can form a serious power. These are three countries with major economies, with quite serious nuclear arsenal. I'm talking about the Russians, and together with the Chinese and the Indians, it's a serious force. What comes to their bilateral relation, then I once heard from a Russian foreign policy analyst that Russia does not have allies; it has situational partners. Now, and not because the Russians are not faithful to their partners, but because they know that all the partners may have some, little something towards Russia. Now, with China, it's more or less simple because for them, for China and Russia, the struggle with the West is more about the survival of the political regime that they are keeping. So they basically have not much of a choice rather than to collaborate together and, turn their backs to one another and support. And, a little bit put under the rug the conflicts that they have about the Amur and other regions over there. India, from this perspective, is way more special because it's a way longer traditional cooperation between the two. And most importantly, they do not share a border. So there's less source for conflicts rather than they have with China, Russia, and China-India relations. So from this perspective, the most friendliest is the most sincerest friendliest is the Russian-Indian one, and the most pragmatic one is the Russia-China one. But the three together, I think it's a quite formidable power together. I think the West should count with that.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to say in the three in Asia, there's always a place for the United States whenever it wants to join.
Look. Add to that. That's okay. Add to that. That's just the problem. The Americans are very worried, particularly about Russia backing Chinese claims to Taiwan. This is where I was saying India is caught in the middle of this battle. But definitely Russian position, particularly since the Russia-Ukrainian war, has strengthened its ties of China in backing China's political goals. And unification of Taiwan means, depends how it's done, but it would mean China would control the sea lines of communication from the Asia Pacific to the Indian Ocean. So because control of Taiwan means you have the naval reach into the Pacific. So this is what's frightening the Americans in the main strategic region, why China is seen, has been seen at least since Obama, even though I would go back to Clinton, as the predominant threat to American interests. But which is also why I argue why we need compromise with China and have to cut a deal with them. And we'll see how that happens.
Are Beijing, Moscow, and Delhi are looking for a new world order? Are they challenging the current world order? Are they looking really for multilateralism? I mean, if we believe that one state wants to honestly pursue multilateralism, I believe that great powers, are focusing, becoming the hegemons, unilateral powers. So that is the interest of the state. However, we hear many times, China especially, using the slogan of multilateralism, and I feel sometimes they hide behind this global approach instead of admitting that we want to control certain parts of the world and dominate. They use this very comfortable, politically correct approach, like we are doing it in the name of multilateralism. What do you think regarding that? I don't know who wants to answer this.
I don't want we start by accusing the Chinese of bad intentions. If you look at the history over the last 20 years, the time of Hu Jintao, China really believed that India will grow up to become a considerable power so that it's not alone to defend Asian interests. But India took time and it could not catch up with China. So China decided saying, we have to do the big job by occupying spaces that are left over so that we don't leave empty spaces for the West to recontrol after the unipolar order started to reduce.
So they are occupying the vacuum left behind?
Exactly. For example, 10 years ago, nobody wanted to go into Africa. And China went there and developed Africa. Now we are accusing China of dominating Africa, which is, I think, unfair. It just went and did some business. It didn't colonize, it didn't take soldiers, etc., to colonize Africa. It just went with its trucks and bulldozers and built roads and railways, and that's what happened. So India didn't do its job. That's one of the reasons why China amplified its power.
Thank you.
If I may pick up, in my opinion, all the three of these countries are interested in globalism because the globalization is basically the source of their, let's say, relative well-being. Being the hegemon in under these circumstances is a very expensive thing to do. So just imagine that, for example, let's take China. I mean, China is quite okay with the situation in which the United States military presence was able to decrease the piracy on the sea routes, and China was able to, increase its maritime exports and basically became a major economic power. But on the other hand, China is not really ready to pay for this security. But the United States, on the other hand, says, if I'm providing this security, then you have to obey the laws, which China says, I can set up my own laws, you just do not intervene in my things. The same applies, in my opinion, also to the Russians and to the Indians to a smaller level. It was once said in the first Eurasian Security Conference in Minsk that the vision of the Eurasian security from the Russian point of view is we keep everything nice and tidy so that the trade between China and Europe can run through us and we can earn some money. Basically, this is how they think. So they want to keep the regime, they want to do money, they want to do business without anyone intervening in the region. Probably this is why it is so important for them to build these land routes, to have interconnections, to not be dependent on the maritime routes, in which they simply cannot compete with the United States as the major naval power. They simply cannot afford it. So while saying multilateralism, they mean, in my opinion, let us do our businesses. You can earn the money with us if you want. Just let us do our own thing on the way that we want to do it. So I don't believe that there is intention to become hegemons in the regions, because it costs a lot. Because if you're the hegemon, you have to have the capabilities, you have to have the resources to ensure and provide security. And they don't want to spend on that, in my opinion.
Hall?
Yeah, I agree with that, but the issue is each power is seeking its own Monroe Doctrine. So the Americans have already declared their Monroe Doctrine in the Caribbean. President Trump is still declaring the Monroe Doctrine versus Venezuela and perhaps Colombia. And Russia's Monroe Doctrine is in clash with NATO enlargement, and it's extending itself into the Black Sea. And India, Bay of Bengal, in clash with Pakistan. But from the American point of view, the one that's most problematic, actually, at least under the Trump administration's view, is China-Taiwan, because China-Taiwan, as I said before, means you control the sea lines of communication from the Pacific to the Persian Gulf. So you have access to oil, control the shipping lanes. And this means that you don't need a maximum amount of power to become a global hegemony, because you control the key point, the pressure point, the lever is the Taiwan situation. And so if we don't come to a compromise with Taiwan soon, I think all know the Thucydides trap theory of Graham Allison. The rising hegemonic power. The rising power clashes with the hegemonic power, and there's a war. There doesn't have to be a war, but the point is that tension is very very evident right now as the U.S. is building up its military in Philippines and Guam to counter the Chinese nuclear programs.
Thank you, Rama.
I'm slightly disagreeing with that. It's a maybe.
Do you have it on?
It was just because you. Yeah, just have to keep it. Okay. What I think is at play is that Russia, India, and China, they're civilizations. There are no borders for civilizations, like nation states. Nation states have borders, but civilizations, they have spheres of influence. Civilization just spreads because other people adopt civilization. For example, Indian civilization reaches from East Africa to Japan. So this is civilizational sphere. Same for China. And China rightly believes that it has to be not a hegemonic order, but the core civilizational force in that region. Same goes with India. Just because the British cut up South Asia into pieces, that doesn't mean that the civilization disappears. It's one civilization, and it has one radiation and one sphere. And that, I think, these three countries, by forming a group together, they're giving priority to the civilizational order and not the international nation state of.
That's a very interesting way of seeing this. And then it reminds me of Huntington Clash of Civilizations.
Yeah.
Do these territories overlap each other? And do they create conflict among these powers? Civilizational conflicts?
It's there's a mixture of a convergence. For example, Central Asia is Russian civilization, Indian civilization, and Chinese civilization together coexisting. It's a fusion of three civilizations. There are no borders. They're just border countries, if you want to establish some kind of delimitation. But there's no delimitation to civilization. It just fuses together. That's the advantage of civilization.
So they basically created BRICS and SCO in order to avoid the clash of civilizations in the overlapping territories.
Okay, Hall, do you want to comment something with the microphone?
Yes. Oh my God. This is a very interesting point. I'm not a fan of Samuel Huntington in particular, but certainly first point, the Americans Trump calls himself America first. In fact, he's North America first. He's extending his American influence, as we just said, in the Caribbean and at least the top of South America and all the way to Canada and Greenland, and looking for the new Arctic route. And so we have a new clash of civilizations in the Arctic, which nobody's, well, I think Trump's very concerned with it, but this is a new vision, the Chinese Polar Silk Road. I think that these will cut, just like the West cut out the Ottoman Empire going through the Suez and around outside the long route around Africa and Asia. The Polar Silk Road is going to reduce trade quite significantly through the Suez Canal. So this is a major thing. I've been worrying about it for years, and focused on the Arctic. But that's not civilization. There's nobody up there. So that's the first part. The second point is that we do have some clashes in that area of Central America. Kazakhstan, the Russians did claim that, and the Chinese sort of said, no, we're in charge. And but you're right, they just agreed. So there is an element of trying to limit potential civilizational conflict in the SCO. I mean, that's what it's about, reducing terrorism and secessionist movements. At the same time, each one of them has secessionist movements, and here's my last point, there are other civilizations in there. We're seeing the clash between the new Taliban and the Pakistani Islamic movements, the Pakistan itself, and we're still seeing India-Pakistan conflict. So there is other civilizations in the middle of these three. That's all.
Thank you.
One way of interpreting Trump's endeavor to integrate Canada, Mexico, etc., saying that I'm disadvantaged because I don't have a civilization. I have to create one. He simply said to Canada, we are the same people. What are you talking about? Just one line cutting the two areas, and let us join hands and create one big civilization. I think that was his.
Yeah, well, America's a totally embedded country, so you're not wrong.
Okay, thank you. I would like to jump back to your comment, Sándor. You mentioned BRICS, as BRICS would work maybe as a bridge regarding the three countries' differences and their position in the global order. They are all founding members of BRICS. However, my question is, what do they expect to gain by BRICS? Probably their goal is very different, each of these countries, maybe not. Is it only anti-US, anti-Western sentiment which guides them into BRICS, or there is something more?
Well, in my opinion, the role of BRICS is, from point of view, for example, of the Russians, right? They would like to have secured markets for their goods, and they want to have a secured substitute source of things that they would need. And BRICS is kind of a substitute to the traditional markets that they used to have, because it's not a military alliance. This is a platform in which various powers can do their own businesses amongst each other, not banning themselves to do business with the West, thanks to which they became richer, right? Without intervening into their domestic policies. It is very hard to imagine BRICS as a serious group, but it is serious. But I mean, a serious force that is centralized, because only three countries can be connected on it, like Russia, China, and India on land. Others are in other continents, right? So it's a little bit different. But it's not something like, I know, European Union or NATO. So the level of their integration is not that high at this point. It is sort of a club of like-minded world players who would like to increase their well-being by using each other's markets and loopholes that they create in order to remain in the globalized world. Because at this point it's very amorph. It's oscillating. Sometimes it seems that it will grow. Other times it seems that they're going to stop the joining of new members and they remain with this BRICS plus thing. So it is not totally formed at this point. But it's clear that they would like to earn money, they would like to cooperate, they would like to build their economies, but without intervening into each other domestic affairs. The SCO that we mentioned previously is something that can link it together, because if you look at the BRICS and the SCO map, then it nearly covers entire Eurasia with Belarus, except of Western Europe, right? And it also reaches to Africa already. So merging the two can create a real block, but they're talking about the dissolution of blocks. So they're talking about multipolarity, connectivity, and stuff, avoiding the formation of blocks. But if you look at the map and we would join the two, then it would create a block. And just a quick reaction to Hall's remark about China and Russia and Kazakhstan. I think the Kazakhs are, if they want to keep someone out of their territory, is the Chinese. They want their money and they want their investments, but they don't want their influence. And they're very happy to keep the Russians in to counterbalance the Chinese influence and counterbalance a little bit the Turkish, Saudi Arabian cultural influence, the one that the old school Kazakh leaders are very afraid of. They don't want to have a very, let's say, Gulf state like Islam in these countries. And talking to experts from that region, this is amongst the number one goals why they want to keep the Russians in, because they always can flip that card to show the others, hey, we have the Russians, so like back off a little bit. Not like they want to keep them as friends. We just discussed with Rama last time that Russians are sometimes useless as friends, but lethal as enemies. So the Central Asians are thinking like that about them a little bit.
Just as exactly, that balance of power is so clear, and particularly in that region where you have these three major civilizations and the minor ones trying to counterbalance each one of those. But I just want to go, when you see, this is where I agree with you. If you look at the SCO, which is security organization, you look at the BRICS, it's economic, but from the American perspective, that economics is challenging U.S. hegemony, and particularly when the BRICS start talking about a common currency, which they haven't been able to do, but they are trading in their own currencies and trying to avoid the dollar. So this is a major impact on the economics. So you have a potential geostrategic alliance linked to an effort to undermine the U.S. dollar at the same time. That's a recipe for conflict.
I feel that the BRICS is a organic extension of the RIC, the trilateral format, and then the SCO. And then, as I said, I don't want to repeat words, saying that China is a very powerful member of the grouping. And now if you see the new members, they come from the Russian civilizational sphere and the Indian civilizational sphere. So there's a good balance of the whole thing. So BRICS is a way of how to integrate the perimeter of Asia into the whole setup.
Unless we consider BRICS the tool of China, which some critics are arguing. Hall, would you like to comment on that?
I'd say the finance is coming from China primarily, and therefore you've got the Asian Investment Bank, I think it's called, and a couple other things that link up with the BRICS and provide the money for the giant infrastructure projects, which this incredible Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a land-based Eurasian endeavor, which is challenging American trade routes everywhere, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And suddenly Americans say, oh, I got to wake up. We have to get our own infrastructure developments to counter those. And India is on that path, trying to bring the Indians closer to the Americans. So this is a new warfare that's going on, economic warfare, geoeconomic warfare that's going on behind the scenes.
Thank you. Rama, would you like to add something?
Because the size of China, we always think it wants to dominate. But the reality is that in 2024, the Kazan summit, BRICS summit, China had a list of 30 countries that it wanted to bring in new members, but it didn't happen. That goes to show that China is not dominating the organization. It is just a big, huge member.
Or someone could argue from outside they want to dominate those 30 countries they bring into the satellite under BRICS for easier cooperation. But okay, I agree with you. I'm not here to discuss, but I'm very happy. I'm very happy to see a panel when we have all different opinions, and I guess it's more fruitful than if everyone would agree. Yes, Hon.
No, just outside of the BRICS, China, when it makes a deal, makes sure that that country breaks its ties with Taiwan. So in that sense, it's another way of controlling those states that don't that want to deal with China and China's finance, but making sure that they don't support Taiwan.
Okay, we saw that. I'm working with Latin America and Chinese American influence in Latin America, and exactly what you said, it was happening in the last couple of years. Countries which wanted to engage with China or receive a Chinese investment, Chinese credit, they had to denounce Taiwan, the recognition of Taiwan. Let's go back. Also, a comment of yours previously, you mentioned the Arctic. And with that, I would like to make a difference between these three players, Russia, China, and India. From the point of view, from the point of view of Washington, probably India is the most consolidatedly behaving actor. We mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, but viewing it from Washington, Chinese presence starting from the Arctic, also Russian presence starting at the Arctic, going down through Greenland. In some countries, Russia in Latin America, namely Venezuela and Cuba, and China basically in all Latin American countries in the Western Hemisphere, which the Trump administration considers now again their sphere of influence. And what we see, China and Russia is trying to appear there, but for some reason India is presenting self-control. I don't know if it's because no capability of India or there is no willingness or it's so different global interest.
Do you want me to answer that question?
Please.
It's a very difficult question. Of the three that we know, that India hasn't been accused of having an expansionist policy. So it's not looking to dominate other regions, and it just has so many problems to solve that it's very busy solving those problems. And
Are these internal problems mostly?
internal problems, regional problems, because India, South Asia was divided after 1947, and somehow those pieces have to be put back together, and that's a huge project that India has not managed to accomplish yet. So first it has to have an inner cohesion, then regional, and then only it can go out. I think India is in this logic. It doesn't want to adventure to far off regions. It is interested because of a lot of energy resources in the Arctic, but it's not capable of projecting its power to that. I think it's a observer fellow of member of the Arctic Council or something like that. I think the Europeans wanted India to be part of that, but nothing. No.
Okay, thank you very much. Talking about regional and geopolitical interests, when we talk about sovereignty, these three countries, they understand the same under sovereignty, and I would like to draw the attention to Taiwan, to the Russian-Ukrainian war, or India's border conflicts. So what is sovereignty for these three states? Is it something different for each?
I think all three share the same definition of sovereignty, in the purest form of sovereignty. That means national independence really means national independence. There's no limit to the national power, and they want to exercise of national power, and they all three of them are very jealous of keeping that independence together intact.
I agree. I mean, when they talk about themselves, but what about when they define other countries' sovereignty? Probably it's very different how India sees um, Western countries' sovereignty or any other third country's sovereignty than China or Russia. And I don't want to go into examples, probably you know what I'm thinking of.
It's not comparable because, for example, if you take a European country, it's the member of the European Union, member of NATO. That means there's no real sovereignty. It's all limited by these kind of structures. So you cannot compare because they have a pure form of sovereignty. Here it's more limited form of sovereignty. That's how I see.
And I would also add that from, for example, Russian perspective and sometimes Chinese, and I believe that in some cases even Indian approach is, when we're talking about sovereignty, is the sovereign right to act on their own way in their own interest, just as the Americans do. But what I mean here is we all support one China, right? But in the United States and in Moscow, they view differently what China is, right? So they would believe that China belongs to Taiwan or Taiwan belongs to China. From this perspective, the Russians can say why we are okay with China and not okay with Abkhazia, Ossetia, the Donbass, or other regions which do not recognize the central powers in their capitals, just like Taiwan does not recognize the central power in Beijing, right? So from this, and I know hypocrisy in foreign policy is a big commonplace, but for those who suffered from it, like the Russians, Chinese, Indians, they feel the sovereign right to act on the same way if their interests, if it serves their interest. In my opinion, there is also this kind of sentiment to the vision of sovereignty in this free capital, but I don't know if Rama agrees with me on that. Or
I totally agree.
thank you.
Well, I would simply say that neither China nor Russia has recognized really Taiwan. China doesn't recognize Taiwan as a sovereign. It doesn't recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. So,
Right.
and you've got the I lived in China for a year during Tiananmen Square, that 1988 to 89 period, and the debates back then were quite ferocious as to when did China really control Taiwan, and if it really did. And you talk to the Taiwanese, of course, and they say they're a totally different civilization and don't relate necessarily to China. And on the Ukrainian side, you have the same kind of debates. So the issue is where can you draw lines and begin to reach compromises where that limit of sovereignty is, and are there gray zones where the two sides can communicate and talk to each other? And we haven't reached that in either Ukraine or China and Taiwan at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We talk about these three countries, China, India, and Russia, often in the perspective from the West. But how do these countries see the West? Do they see the West as one consolidated power, the West, or they differentiate between the United States, Europe, or the others? So what is the West for these three countries? Rama, please.
The West until the 1990s was a consolidated sphere, and they respected the fear that was space but powerful economically, militarily, and they dominated the global affairs. But then, since that time now, especially since 2015, around 2015, the West is no longer the West. It's pieces. It's European Union disunited, it's the United States, it's Canada, it's Britain, So the West is a kind of a whole galaxy of mini orders. That's what they realize. And coming together, they say, this is the time to unite ourselves, not against somebody, but at least the West will leave them alone to unite. That's what I feel. Now they no longer see the West as one unity, but many. Europe, United States, Britain.
Thank you. Or would you like to add something?
I've never liked the term the West. I never saw the United States and Europeans as unified. I mean, the Americans fought the Brits way back when to declare independence. Our democracies are totally different. The form of democracy we have in the United States is totally different than the form of democracies we have in Europe. We parliamentary democracies primarily, and we have a presidential democracy. The civilizational influence, in my view, are, of course, America dominated Europe. That's true, and that's what's changed. Is American domination is no longer the same, and the Europeans are at least attempting to assert themselves. But the Americans, one of the reasons for NATO enlargement was precisely to keep the Europeans down because they're afraid of German unity, and how German unity would spark a stronger Europe, which didn't really happen the way it used to be talked about. Fortress Europe never really happened. But the point is that was one of the fears when NATO started at large to assert American hegemony over Europe. But there's still, I think the Russians, Chinese, and Indians all know how to play the different, particularly the Chinese, I'd say Russians too, but the Chinese have been playing the West against each other for years, so really since the 80s, if not earlier. They know when they could play one power against another, one industry against another.
So what I see from the Russians' perspective, how they see the West, they usually refer to the term collective West, which is not necessarily a geographical term because they consider Japan and South Korea to be also part of this collective West. But how they really consider the West is something like Snow White and a bunch of dwarfs, where Snow White is the United States and others are the dwarfs running around. And they still cannot get out of the very old Cold War type of vision of the West, where there's the United States, which rules the things, saying that there's one big Democrat that basically set the rules for other Democrats in the West. And in many cases, they do not consider the other parties, for example, members of G7, as sovereign actors. So they consider them as copycats or followers of the United States. And with the second coming of Trump, they describe this this entire situation in the West as a crisis, where the traditional Western dwarfish powers, they kind of get together and try to survive the Trump chaos, so that things are going to go back to the things they are. And this is where they see the well, not weakness, but the window of opportunity to set their deals with the big guy, with Trump. Because if they're gonna get to deal with Trump, then he will make the others in the team align and obey, which is not the case. But many of those dinosaurs in the Kremlin still believe it's like that. In the analytical sphere and in the academia, the view is different. But many amongst the decision makers still live in this kind of a bubble.
So you say they think they get away with Snow White and the dwarfs will line up.
Yeah, so you have a good deal with Snow White, and she's gonna do the rest with the other dwarves. They are still dwarves after all.
Thank you, Rama.
I slightly disagree with the idea of the West. If you see the 1980s, since the founding of the G7, it acted as a real world government, and they really made decisions that influenced the whole world, the economic order especially. And that was very important event when the leaders of the G7 met and decided the currency levels, etc., and the solutions for the Middle East and And there was Margaret Thatcher, Mitterrand, Kohl. You cannot say that Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, they were giants, I think. And the purpose of the G7 was to mull the United States so that it doesn't go unilateral and do whatever it wants. It was a way of controlling the power of the United States, and it did a very good job, I think, until now it started falling apart.
Hal, would you like to comment on that?
No, it was just reminding me when Russia actually wanted to join it in the G8, and the joke at the time was there were different jokes, but it was South Africa with nuclear weapons, and some people said it was Ghana with nuclear weapons, because the Russian economy didn't look that strong now, but that's a very different viewpoint from today. But certainly the G8 was a more active organization than it is now, and unfortunately it's really a sign of the division in the West, and that's where I'm saying China, in my view, was the most sophisticated in playing among the U.S. and European divisions. India didn't play that game, and Russia, you're probably right, thought of it as the Snow White. You deal with Snow White and forget about the Europeans, but I swear China played everyone against each other.
It was probably the G8 thing Russia felt as a dwarf. That's why they use this thing.
Okay. You agreed, and you brought also some examples saying that sometimes there are differences between Moscow, Beijing, and Delhi, and that's completely normal. But what we see sometimes that Moscow somehow is convinced that he has to bring together Beijing and Delhi into a cooperation to strengthen the RIC or BRICS or whatever group we want to call them. However, would that be possible? I mean, we spoke about it earlier, Rama. Until recently, there was no commercial flight between China and India, and we talk about a couple of months. So very basic issues of diplomacy and security challenges on the borders, let's name between Russia and China, between China and India, they exist. And maybe with a little bit of change of wind, they could grow. So how do you see that?
I don't want to exaggerate the problems because during the First World War, when Germany went to war with France, each side 1.5 million people were killed. During the Second World War, around 8 million Germans were killed. Some border clash, and maybe there are 20 people killed, etc. It's
different.
It's
size.
different. And they're living together with civilizations from 6,000 years old, 6,000 years. So I don't want to make it into a big thing. The other thing is that what we see on the other side is going to make them cooperate. These problems will vanish when see the real problem, real danger, as I see it, is that the upcoming of a new American empire is suddenly starting to be formed. And what we are seeing with the actions of not coherent actions we normally say of Trump, they're very coherent because he wants to build a new empire. When the Russians and the Indians and Chinese look at that and say the scope of this empire coming up, rising, they will say our differences are no longer differences. We put them to a side.
You could argue also from outside, like Russia is also building an empire, returning to its former borders and sphere of influence.
I disagree with that.
You disagree with that, okay?
In the sense that it wants to stop the West taking away part of its empire.
It's one way to say it, yes. Okay, Hal.
Yeah, I just it's preclusive imperialism. You know, it is precluding the NATO and EU enlargement into Russian spheres of influence. So I see it as a preclusive action as opposed to an aggressive action. It was a different point of view. But I want to get back to this American empire issue because this is why I started out the original discussion with that we are seeing an alliance of NATO, EU, with the dwarves pretty much following the line, but trying to engage in their own military buildup in Germany and Poland particularly. France as well, extending a nuclear umbrella over Eastern Europe. And to the east, we see United States, we didn't mention this, the AUKUS Pact, the UK, Australian, US, and then the Quad, also linking the Quad. The AUKUS Pact is a real military pact with Australia, the Brits and the Americans. The Quad links Japan and India, at least, and some other states together, and that's seen as a new containment of China. And that's where originally I was saying India is kind of caught up in that, doesn't know which side it's going to go, but the Americans are pressing the Indians to move into the Quad or strengthen their relations with Australia and Japan to create a naval containment of China. And that's where I see the real crisis coming, as I said before, if we don't find a compromise over Taiwan in this new clash of China trying to assert its Monroe Doctrine in the region, which means somehow absorbing or pressuring Taiwan into a new unity. The problem is, do you put the Chinese Navy on Taiwan or not? That's going to be the big issue. But the point is that this is this new American empire effort to achieve a new empire may or may not succeed. In part, it depends on how inward the Americans turn, but also whether or not they can form this new alliance. So the questions are still there. But the tensions are definitely mounting over this question.
Thank you.
Follow.
Sándor.
Well, I think India can have its, let's say, own AUKUS on its own with the initiative that I think they call Necklace of Pearls, which consists of a bunch of naval bases in order to have some leverage against the Chinese naval.
Chinese necklace.
Necklace of Pearls is
Chinese bases.
Chinese bases.
Against the
Cool. So they have their own thing on that against India. But what I coming to the original question of Moscow trying to bring China and India together, I don't think that it will work. But the vision in Moscow is that in the recent years they were very comfortable with the situation that they have good bilateral relations between Russia and India, Russia and China, and India and China never asked Russia to help or to moderate their own conflicts. For the Russians, it would be important to have that conflict settled because Russia relies very seriously on both India and China. And they have a fear that if things gone bad between China and India, one of them will make a choice to whom to cooperate with. Plus, we see that if the relations between China and India will not be that good, then the adversaries of Russia can play them out against Russia. So Russians' first interest over here is to make it, let's say, broker a deal between China and India in order that none of them can be played against Russia. Because they saw how China was turned away, and India was not turned away just because it was upset with the US, because it never supported it in a way that it wanted to. So if the relation of China and Russia is very resource-based, the relations of India and Russia is way more complex. There's a very serious cooperation in the military. For example, the fifth generation fighter jets of Russia would most probably not be built without Indian support and Indian IT. And the Russians know that, and the Indians know that. And of course, they want to have this triangle closed, but the third leg of this one is still open between China and India, and Russia will not be the one who will be able to close that.
Thank you. Regarding the oil deal between Russia and India, which is soon to end, probably, was that just a comfortable economic solution for India to purchase cheap oil while Russia can provide it, or were there some strategic thinkings behind it, and now it just gave up very easily because the Trump administration asked them to give up? So let's take advantage while we can, cheap oil, or what was behind that cooperation?
India has a very simple strategy. Unlike the United States or Russia, survival. It's called survival. You just survive. And cheap oil is good for India because it has 1.5 billion people and it's a lot of oil is needed. It's a developing economy. And if Russia provides it, good for that. So they will buy it from Russia. There's no other thoughts than saying. And if it's coming from a friend, even better.
It's more pragmatic than ideological.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, especially given the fact that the Westerners who are refused to buy the Russian oil are happy to buy it from India. So refined, yeah, why India would give this chance up. So it's a very clever position to do. Good strategy to survive.
Okay. I would like to have like a closing last discussion, and I would like to ask you your opinion. How do you see these three countries' relation developing in the next 10 years? I know we don't have a crystal ball, and we don't like to say what if, but in your expertise, in your studies, your readings, what do you make of the next 10 years regarding these three powers?
If I may start shortly, because I have probably the last thoughts on this one. If you look at the cooperation between Russia, India, and China from this perspective, I would predict or just see from the imaginary crystal ball that this cooperation remains strong and probably will be even closer. Just simply from the matter of fact that China, India, and Russia have the luxury of keeping their, let's say, political leadership a longer term than compared to others on the West. So even the presidential term in Russia is 7 years, not 4 years like in the US. So 10 years for them is not that much. It's a perspective that they can reach, not to mention China. And I think India is also persistent to this one. So if there will be no black swan events in these countries, then the direction that is being set now will continue in the upcoming 10 years. 10 years, it seems a lot for us, but on long perspective and the perspective of interstate relations is still a quite comfortable distance to remain on the same track, in my opinion. But, we can say this today, tomorrow something happens and everything falls apart.
Thank you. Rama? Or Hall?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I say it depends on whether or not President Trump or the next American president can engage in what they call the reverse Nixon strategy, that is drawing Russia at least closer to the Europeans and the Americans, drawing it somewhat away from China, though I agree with you, it's never going to be totally broken apart. It would be foolish to do that. Otherwise, if a reverse Nixon strategy fails, I will predict that Russia and China will move closer together as the United States puts more pressure in the Far East. And as India will be caught in the middle, and India will be forced to move closer to Russia and China, precisely because the United States is already beginning to threaten sanctions and other things to prevent. Ideally, the Americans want the Indians not to join, but they're actually doing the opposite, in my view, by pressuring India on this energy issue. Energy is so vital for the Indian economy. So I'm afraid that we're moving into a new alliance polarization. If, as I said, if we can't draw Russia at least somewhat closer to the United States and Europe.
Thank you. Rama?
I see it slightly different in the sense that one big thing, one big actor that we did not discuss is that the market. The power of the West is the market. And let's see that for the last 10 years now, the growth in Europe is close to zero than anything else. So there'd be a collapse of consumption. So it'll be less attractive as a market for Japan, countries like Japan and Korea. So all of them will see China and India as being more attractive than Europe comparatively. And this will do the trick by tipping Japan into the Asian camp and not be a kind of satellite of the West. You see worse. Same with Korea. Because of the power of the consumption in Asia, it have to see that it's rising in India and China. That means these two countries will join the Asian group, and that will tip the balance.
So you believe their strategic interest is stronger than their mistrust in each other because of the world outside? I define it as the West from their point of view.
Until it is defined as a threat for the survival of the system, then yes. If I mean, what Hall said about reverse Nixon, it worked with China because the Chinese system received like stone cold guarantees that it will not be bothered. The regime, the system can remain, and there is a set of recognition internationally that make it worth for the Chinese to behave the way that they did. This is also related to Taiwan, right? With Russia at this point, as I said, they plan on long term because their cycles are longer. So they wouldn't risk a short period of a honeymoon with Trump, for example, that would last for now less than 4 years, for something that can last longer with the Chinese. Plus, there are still no guarantees for them that the way that they are running the state, the way that the state visions itself, will be recognized, and it will be safe from the West. Until this will happen, this triangle or alliance is kind of deemed or doomed to be together, in my opinion. But I don't know. I must be wrong, or I can be wrong.
I think there's every scope for strengthening of the trilateral aspect because of the market India provides, the technological superiority China provides, and the resource base of Russia. There's complementarity between the three, and also because of the, I think, political compatibility also is going to strengthen them further rather than divide them.
I would just add to that the whole democracy. I was in China during the Tiananmen protests, and certainly the one of the reasons the Chinese have really tightened up against American influence is precisely because they saw those movements as trying to destabilize the monopoly of power of the Chinese Communist Party, just as they were doing. This was happening in Poland at exactly the same time when solidarity was rising. The democracy movement was coming about, and this was one of the things that said, no, they're after us, the party. We have to protect ourselves. And this is why this militarization has really stems from that period even more than some of the other issues. So the problem is democracy is destabilizing. In democracy, American advocacy of global democratization has really destabilized both Russia and China and brought them together. India's a different case there, and that's why India is somewhat in between. But if the United States keeps putting pressure on India, that they'll push them together. Now, Japan, you raised the big question. The Japanese, their relations with the Americans, atomic bomb, all since then, there's a lot of resentment beneath the surface. So you don't know where they're going to go. And the Chinese are all, but the Chinese have always been worried about the rise of Japan, and Americans are seen as fueling Japanese militarism. So that's why I slightly disagree with you, but you're right. If they can't find a market, where are they going to go? So yeah, I mean, but Japan is seen as a threat to China and Russia, based on history of the Russia-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese Wars, etc.
Country of old people.
Oh, that's another problem. But anyway, you're right. You got a point on where the balance could shift. I still think it's in India.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. And I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions for the panelists, just raise your hand and I take the microphone.
Yes, hello. I heard that the soft spot for the Chinese are their dependence on oil and gas, and the Russians agreed to build a second pipeline. My question is, if this comes about, then they're vetted for the energy to go to China. How long will this pipeline take to build? And a second part question is in India, how does India get its Russian energy? Do they have pipelines and everything? Okay.
The power of Siberia too, the gas pipeline that is going to run from deep Siberia to China through Mongolia, is planned to be operational by 2030. The biggest chunk of the construction is on the Chinese end, and it will be financed by the Chinese. The Russian will build maybe less than 1/3 of the entire distance, and they're already working on it. So over here, the main question is how eager the Chinese will be. But as per the preliminary contract, 2030 must be the operational phase, and the maximum capacity must be later on 50 billion cubic meters per year, but they're going to start with maybe 10 or 20. And the contract says that they will, so they try to avoid the take or pay formula from this one. Regarding India, well, they're always trying to build a pipeline that would connect it, but at this point, the ports through Iran runs to India in many cases, and the fleet that Russia operates running from the Baltic Sea around, operating the Shadow Fleet with, I don't know, around 400 vessels transporting the goods. But there used to be plans back in the Soviet era to build a pipeline that would connect on land India, but there were some minor problems in Afghanistan and Pakistan that kind of make made yeah, my minor problems over there made these things obsolete. But at this point, we see very promising projects with the Trans-Afghan Railway, and certain parts of it, the northern 60-70 kilometers, are already operational and they're being operated by the Uzbekistani Railway Company. So if that will be built, then it can provide another connection that would complement the international north-south transportation corridor that runs from Russia through the South Caucasus, Iran, and then ends up in India. But the Indian part is Rama.
And it's also not impossible to think that Russia has very good relations with Pakistan, and maybe Russia builds the pipeline and supplies the gas to and oil to India rather than India building the pipeline towards Russia. So that should be being also busy Central Asian party. Yes, this already it's a lot of pipelines.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No? Then I will have one more and then I let you go. You raised the reverse Nixon strategy regarding China and Russia. And probably you agree that one of the bothersome actor in that would be Europe, who doesn't want to engage Russia currently. But that's not the only difference between Europe and the United States regarding these three players. And I would like to reduce the question rather to two players, Russia and China. Let's leave India out. Considering Russia and China, I think Europe and the US has a very different approach. Europe, you can argue with right or no right, but it's rather antagonistic with Russia. And the United States Trump government currently wants to engage Russia. At the same time, the United States is very antagonistic with China, and Europe is was looking and still looking towards China as a possible economic relief for the old continent. So, how do you think in the coming future the United States and Europe will solve out this difference?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question. certainly the Europeans, because of the tensions with Russia, you always look at the other flank. You want to go to the ally on the other side, who's in this case is China. And the Europeans have been talking for years of opening up arms. After Tiananmen Square, there was a arms embargo, etc. And the Europeans have always been pushing for arms trade to China after that period. And the United States has always blocked it. Now, if the United States continues to put sanctions on European products and other things, the Europeans are going to look towards China as one of the few markets available to them. If the Russian market is closed down, they'll look to India too, and they're doing that. This is going to create a counterbalancing movement of the European economy, which is still quite large, even though it's having its issues. So this will leave the Americans trying to look to the Russians to counterbalance that, and by moving towards Russia. So if Russia and Americans can make a deal, and that's precisely the scenario that happened in World War I, where the French looked to the Russians to counterbalance the Germans, and the Brits tried to make a deal with the Germans and failed. So that's a historical analogy, but the point is that there will be counterbalancing movements here, and it's not clear to me. Let's put it this way: the Eurasian continental landmass has a greater chance of drawing itself together than the insular maritime. That's what I'd see in a geopolitical sense. The insular maritime is going to have a hard time maintaining their alliance precisely because this is what the gas deal with Russia and China is about, creating a land route. So they can't be, China's energy can't be blocked by sea, which is the American strength. So but the Chinese don't want that. That's why they want to control Taiwan. So this tension will continue around that, and the Europeans will also be caught in a pivot where they either have to move closer to the Americans or look to China, but they're not going to look to Russia for a while.
Thank you. Rama?
I think the reverse Nixon thing is a little bit degrading idea as far as Russia is concerned, because we started talking about national sovereignty and how they guard national sovereignty. Part of that is saying we are not part of China. Russia will never be part of China because it's a sovereign country. So they thinking that it will somehow part of China, I think it's nonsense. I think it never will be. Another thing, if Trump wants to reverse something, then he can liquidate NATO, which he will not do because American power over Europe is through NATO. So it's a difficult thing. And yeah, that's what I was.
Okay.
Continue. Yeah, I'll be here all night. I won't be here all night, but no, that you're right. Trump's not going to, as much as he said he would, pull away from NATO. He's not going to do that. In fact, he actually strengthened NATO during his first term. And now he's forcing them to pay. But that's just the point. The Europeans, by forcing them to pay, makes them think, oh, we have to act strategically now, and begin to unify our defense structures. And this is what I'm saying. That's why they're going to look to China for. Once they build up their armaments industry, which is happening right now, they're going to have to look for export markets, and China will be one of the dominant export markets. The Europeans are already selling France is selling the Rafale to India, so that market is opening up too. So you have the Europeans looking to new markets precisely because they know they want to reduce their dependence on the United States, and this will create tensions between the United States and Europe. And so I think that's clearer than what I said before.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your time and participation. And thank you very much for you being here with us. And I let you go. and we are expecting you back for our next session in the near future. Thank you very much.